Well, Eric, thanks for being on the show. Saka's Is That So? It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Saka. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Fantastic. Well, um, Eric, I know that you operate in multiple different capacities, and we've known each other for a few years. But as an introduction to yourself, you're the director of corporate accountability at the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but for the audience to get to know you a little bit more, what exactly does that role entail, and how did you kind of get into that?
Sure. So, how I got into that will explain a lot because it wasn't a straight and narrow path. So, I'll go back to coming to DC. So, I came to DC to intern at the Obama White House. I was at the Office of Management and Budget. And being in DC during that time, it was a very exciting time for me. I fell in love with the city and I wanted to stay here. So I did, and I almost got a job at the OMB. If it wasn't for Congress is cutting the budget of the OMB, I would have gotten a job and my life would be very different. But it didn't. And I still wanted to stay in DC. I felt a passion about staying here, so I wanted to figure out how to do it. Now, at this point in my life, I had just finished my internship at the White House. I had just also finished my master's degree. So I had my master's degree. And I also had just finished my Fulbright grant. I was a year in Hungary studying discrimination of the Roma there. And so I had all these things under me and several years of work experience. I'd worked for years in the law firm in Harlem and had done other things in my life. But in order to do what I wanted to do, in order to stay in the city, I took a job as a receptionist, something that a lot of people I think would have not done because I've done all these things. How can I just be a receptionist? But my
Yeah.
desire to stay in the city was more than my desire to not, my pride to not sit in a receptionist desk.
Yeah, I mean, going from Fulbright scholar to receptionist, that must have been a tough one to swallow.
It was in a way, but it gave me time. So one of the, I got to appreciate the job. I mean, I always appreciated jobs that many people take for granted, receptionists and other things like that. My mom is a home health aide. My dad was a handyman. So I've grown up um, appreciating these roles and responsibilities and the impact that they have in our everyday lives. And so I didn't see it as a shameful thing, but I also got to know the role itself and how to be good at something that I wasn't trained for or wasn't part of my background. But what it also gave me was time. It took me a fairly short amount of time to get used to the role, and I was able to create some space and time for myself to think about things. And that's where I came up with the idea to start my business, GlobeServe Consulting, which then after having spent some time at my receptionist job, I got another job, and then fairly shortly after that, I got a contract, a 1-year contract with a nonprofit locally where I dealt with interstate issues on discrimination here in the DC area. Now, and it was after finishing that 1-year contract that I finally made it to HACR, so the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility, and that was as a result of them looking for a contractor to help them with a survey that they administer annually called the Corporate Inclusion Index. That survey is administered to Fortune 500 companies and HACR corporate members to measure how these companies are doing with respect to the inclusion of Hispanics in a variety of areas, mainly in their employment practices, procurement practices, philanthropic efforts, and their governance structure. And so I came on board to help them with that. And then over the years, I mean, they offered me a job, and it was a good offer, so I took it, and I become responsible for the survey. So now I am responsible for the administration of the survey, the analysis of the data, the reporting of the results to both the participants and the general public in our annual CII report. And I do several other projects. One of the things that is part of my responsibility as a director of corporate accountability as well is to talk to companies about what it is that they need to do in order to bridge that gap with being inclusive in these 4 areas that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to hear that because when you hear of discrimination or accountability, diversity and inclusion, any of those kinds of things, your mind typically goes to the African American experience, right? Because there it's a bit more blatant. And I know you guys can probably hear what sounds like gunshots in the background, but that's because
It's
people are celebrating the election.
yes, it's all because of Saka's birthday. Saka's birthday, so
Maybe it's my birthday or the election, which I know will come into. But why do you think people don't typically think of the Hispanic experience when it comes to discrimination and DNI and things like that?
I think, well, there's a lot of things going on here, right? So there are historical reasons for why the African American experience is particularly tied to diversity and inclusion and discrimination in this country. It is so tightly knit. It is part of the fabric, the foundational fabric of the country. When the founders came to the country, they came with slaves. And so as a result of that, and hundreds of years of this of just abuse and injustice, it has become part of the story of how to overcome this. Certainly, there's also a story of discrimination and a separate history for Hispanics or Latinx or the Latinx community in their own countries of origin. But participants in this country, our history is a bit later, with the annexation of Western lands and Southern lands in this country, and then as a result of migration in subsequent years. But there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of similarities in the ways that we are discriminated against, in the way that we are kept from enjoying the same kinds of privileges that others that can enjoy and have access to. And so that's why organizations like ours exist, in order to help make sure that there is a level playing field for everyone in these companies in this country.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I think it might be difficult as well is because Hispanic is a relatively broad or overarching term, and there's some, Hispanics that can practically be Caucasian in terms of culture, name, in terms of appearance as well, and then you get the other side of the Hispanic range. So it really does fluctuate, and I think because of that diversity within that spectrum, maybe it's a bit harder to pinpoint as opposed to like Black people, who's like clearly visible. There's a sort of singular kind of identity amongst them. Would you say
Right.
that's one of the reasons why it's a bit tougher to to police, or one of the reasons why people haven't put their sort of thumb on this particular issue, or not really?
Yeah, no, it's very complicated. So you're absolutely right. Hispanic is not a race; it's an ethnicity. And so within the Hispanic ethnicity, we have all races. I mean, we have Hispanic, Asian, Hispanic, Afro Latinos, and Afro Hispanics. We have Hispanics from all backgrounds and racial diverse. And we have a lot of racial diversity in our ethnicity. And so yes, we have not only the issues that are shared by Hispanics, but also sub issues that are shared with other races. So the Afro Latino community shares a lot of in common with the African American community, and shares a lot of the same discriminations, both within this country and historically from their countries of origin, because there is a history of a slavery in the Spanish colonies as well. So there's a lot of similarities there. And one of the things that the Hispanic community has been trying to deal with for many years, and will I think we'll have to deal with, especially going forward after all the events of this year, is how to not treat the Hispanic community as a monolith, and how to take into account all the differences between the different Hispanic groups, and the difficulties that they're having in becoming successful, having equality and justice for them in each of those communities as well.
Yeah, one of the things I've always struggled with was, you don't want your identity to become who you are, or to use your identity as a lens by which you view the entire world, right? Because on one hand, you want the best ideas to win, or a corporation should be meritocratic, whereby the best person wins. But then that the reality of the world is, if you're Black and your name sounds a certain way, or if you're Hispanic and things like that, you have a lower propensity of getting that job, or to be viewed as a CEO. People be like, whoa, your CEO is Black. It's kind of like awkward, or they don't expect that. So you're kind of forced to, I don't say hide behind, but use your group identity as well, in order to push for some agenda within a corporation as either an employee resource group or something like that, or you're kind of forced to go into it because we don't live in a world that is truly fair and free and things like that. So I actually wanted to touch a bit more on that. Do you ever find that personally from yourself, that you struggle with that, what's the right thing to do versus the reality of the world?
Yes. So there's several things going on with the statement you just made, Saka, and that's that. Um, yes, we would love to live in a world where you took everything at face value, right? That everything was worth exactly what it was intended to be worth, and everyone would take, you know, uh, uh, will be presented with something and just say, oh, this is worth this much because that's exactly what is being presented to me. But um, the reality is that because we're human, and we have innate and internal biases, those things don't play out that way. And one of the problems with incorporating minority groups into practices, into events and programs, um, among companies and other organizations, not just companies, is that there's a fight between two opposing sides. One is that the companies and organizations that exist in the world and that we all know and love have become that way because they have systems that they've put in place in order to become successful, and they have norms on how to do things in order to keep themselves that way. And on the other side is change. In order to remain relevant, in order to continue to succeed in the world of the future, you will need to change and adapt. Now, in order to marry those two worlds, you'll have to accept that some things that you were doing may need to change, and some of the ways that you were making decisions may need to change. One of the toughest practices that companies tend to struggle with in terms of making those changes is the norms of practices with respect to other people. Um, who do we hire? Where do we hire from? I mean, even very simply, hiring from some of the best schools in the world, from your Harvards and Oxfords and Cambridge and other schools like that. There's a very good reason why people tend to turn to those schools for talent, is because talent tends to be turned out of those schools very successfully and very high rates. But that's not where you tend to find diversity. It's a problem. Not yet. I'm not saying that these schools are not looking to be diverse or they're not making those issues. Obviously, I know that they are. But as of yet, most diverse groups do not graduate from these schools. And so if you're looking to diversify your employee population, if you're looking to diversify your interns, then you probably should look at other areas as well. Black serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions here in this country, Native American serving institutions, and others, um, as a source for where to find this talent. The same goes for businesses. When procurement teams look for businesses to contract with, they often rely on their networks. But the problem is that their networks have for a long time been very white, very male. And there's nothing wrong with it. I've been successful doing that for many years. But if you really want to take diversity and inclusion seriously, you're going to have to look outside of those networks. Go to the communities that you want to do businesses with, that are your customers, and start looking there as well.
Yeah, the problem goes so far back, and it's so entrenched in many different ways. As you mentioned, it goes back to education, it goes back to so many different things, and it compounds. So for us to change the narrative, it's going to be, a huge difference, and a big undertaking as well. I remember one of the reasons why I was glad that I went to Cal was the fact that they didn't have affirmative action. So no one could ever say, oh, he got in because he was Black or something like that. You know what I mean? And unfortunately, that's just the reality of the way the world is. They need to put policies to allow more diverse people to get in, but at the same time, you get that perception of, oh, he was only allowed in because he's a certain way. So I'm glad I don't have to deal with that psychologically going forward.
Right.
But it's an issue that people face.
And yeah, and that's the flip side, Saka. That what you're talking about there is stereotype threat, right? And I'll talk about my own personal experience and story about how I went through that. I mean, I listened to some of your earlier podcasts, and there was one where you mentioned the fact that coming from certain cultures, there's only really a handful of occupations that are acceptable by parents, right? Doctor, engineer, for lawyer, right? For me, it was lawyer. So I was an argumentative young lad, and so when my parents were seeing that growing up, they said, "Oh, you should be a lawyer." So that they were grooming me to be a lawyer from a very young age, and I was doing everything I needed to do. I expressed my interest in law as a young kid, and I worked. My first job out of college was at a law firm where I was taking on my own cases. I was very successful at it. But throughout my journey, I always questioned, am I good enough to be a lawyer? When I came back, the reason why I did a Fulbright was because I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a lawyer or get a higher education degree in another discipline. And the
Not a
reason
bad
for that,
option to choose, by the way, being a Fulbright as opposed to those two. But yeah.
well, the reason for that confusion was that I felt like I wasn't good enough to be a lawyer yet. And I never got to the point where I felt good enough to be a lawyer because there weren't many lawyers that looked like me, not many lawyers that came from where I came from, my neighborhood. And I just didn't know what it needed to make it there. And also, I saw how lawyers of color were being treated by other lawyers, and I didn't want to experience that. I wanted to be so good that there was no way that someone could say something about me about being here only because I was a certain color or from a certain background. And so that hindered me from taking that path. I don't regret the path that I'm on now, but that is what keeps some of us from pursuing our dreams and passions, whether that be businesses or professions which we are passionate about, but are a little bit afraid of to partake in. Um, and so that was part of my story, and I think it comes back to some of the things, some of the disadvantages that some of us have growing up. When I was looking to apply to colleges, my guidance counselor, who was helping me through the process, told me that I shouldn't apply to 4-year colleges because they're harder to get into. And that really had an effect on me. I mean, I didn't apply to some of the colleges that I would have applied to had I not heard that. And what I did wind up doing was applying to some anyway, and I got a full ride to Hofstra University, where I graduated from in Long Island. Um, and so but that no matter how successful I have been since then, those words stayed with me. Am I good enough? Have always been following me around throughout my professional career, and I see that, and it's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about what I do, because I see that from others. I see that from other businesses, employees, and people that I know, and I just want to make sure that they know, and that the decision makers at these organizations know that these are good people. They will work for you and they will make your business more successful if you give them a chance.
Yeah, I want to touch a bit more on that part where you said, you weren't good enough because, transitioning over into the sort of the corporate space. So you looked at it from a personal perspective. Was I good enough for certain things or not? And corporations must be asking themselves as well, are we good enough? Are we doing well enough to foster or cater to the Hispanic experience or the African American or whatever it is? So
Right.
based on the surveys and things that you've done, what was the situation like when you actually went in there to actually analyze, or you were trying to help companies? Was there anything that stood out to you like, wow, these guys are really not paying attention to it? Or I'm trying to get a sense of where things were and anything that stood out to you so that they know if they're good or bad, and then also where they're going or where they're heading to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there was when I first started at HACR, there was a huge lack of um, measuring and keeping track of metrics. Um, so companies wanted to know what to do, and what is it that I need to do in order to get more Hispanic employees? Where do I need to look? But there was no efforts. There were no efforts being made, or very few, on tracking their success. So if we, for example, in a survey established a benchmark for attaining, high marks for our survey for a certain percentage of employees in your company, a company can go out and recruit up to that percentage of go real hard and recruit up to that percentage of employees over 1 year in order to get that high mark. But then they don't implement any foundational practices to keep those employees. They don't keep track of any of their metrics on, why employees are leaving, what's the turnaround rate, And that leads to a lot of failure. And in fact, and even more dangerously, what it leads to is some people saying that, well, we've tried with the Hispanic community already, and we haven't been successful.
Oh,
And
really?
so, right, and so, what we are trying to do and avoid as an organization helping companies through this process is say, you need to establish these benchmarks internally. You need to start keeping track of this. You need to start measuring where your successes are and where your failures are, for to be frank. I mean, we no longer publish um, company ratings in detail, because what we want to do is make companies comfortable enough to give us the data so that they can see where they're doing well as where they're doing not so well, so that they can make those improvements. Because it's not just about celebrating the good stuff, it's also about identifying where the gaps are. And to be honest, I think it's great that companies are doing some good things, but the real valuable information is where you're not doing good things, because that's where the improvement lies. That's where you can get better, and that's where you can get more competitive. So that's what I do with the companies, about showing them where those gaps are, showing them how they can improve and be better, and where they can leverage what they already have to continue that improvement.
I'm a big believer in self-interests, and I think that corporates always do what's in their best interest, whatever is going to help them with profit or look
For
better
sure.
from a PR perspective or whatever it is, right? And so I guess previously what would happen is you get the wonderful brochure that looks so diverse, but then you get the board member picture and it's not very diverse, right? So
Right, right, right.
trying to serve their interest to the cheapest, most efficient means. But now, is there any type of self-serving interests that corporates have or businesses have to actually be diverse?
Now, yes, there is a self-serving interest, even on the highest levels, even in boards. And I would say that if if you're really looking into breaking into these community, I mean, breaking in is probably a wrong term, but if you're really looking to establish a relationship with these communities, a mutually beneficial relationship, you're going to need to understand the culture. You're going to need to understand the people, and your decision makers are going to have experiential knowledge about this. They're going to need to really know what Hispanics want in this country, what African Americans want, what Asian Americans want. In order to have that, you need diversity on the board. You need diversity on the board and in the C-suite. And this is one of the areas where we're still, the slowest growing um, from all the other areas. Hispanics are less than 1% of all board members in Fortune 500 companies, and also they're less than 1.1% of all board members are Latinas. So very, very few Latinas from
Wow.
our research are in corporate boards, and there's a really big missed opportunity there. And I take this back to that habit. So as Marcus Aurelius says, what stands in the way becomes the way. So they say that they can't find the talent, and so that becomes the way. Oh, we can't
Wow.
find talent, so we don't look.
Heard that.
We don't look. Um, and that's really a detriment. And they've become very used to doing things the way that they do. There are plenty of opportunities, not just in the board space, in the leadership space, in the talent space, but also in the small business and procurement space. There are a ton of minority businesses out there who are looking for these opportunities, who would love to work with a large company to become better at what they do. Um, but companies keep saying that they can't find these businesses, that they can't find businesses that can work at scale. And so one of the messages that we give our participants is that might be true now, but if you want to change that, then you need to work with the business community in order to change that. What programs do you have internally to help those businesses become more capable of doing business with you and growing to scale?
Yeah, I like that. I actually want to touch a bit more on that sort of economic opportunity that's part of it, because a lot of times people think it's just a kumbaya, feel good, let's do this, but there is an economic incentive, right? Not just for corporations, but for the small businesses themselves. Are we missing out on prosperity for more people, for the corporates, for the small businesses, because we're not doing this? And have we been able to quantify it and anything like that?
Yes, there are plenty of studies out there that do quantify the loss in opportunity, particularly in doing businesses with certain minority groups, and it's a loss. It's a loss. And I hear companies, and their concerns. Some of these businesses, they would like more minority businesses to be certified through organizations like NMSDC and others like that, and that's great. But they really have to understand that certification can be a hurdle for certain small businesses if you really want to get in on the ground and work with a community, very local community, very small businesses. You either have to help with that process of certification, or at least provide some mentorship to get certified, or not require it, because it is a hurdle. Help the business grow, take the risk, because while it will be difficult for companies to take on this new norm, um, uh, not doing it is also not really helping their goals and efforts, because they do have goals. Companies, at least the ones that participate in our survey, have goals to increase the diversity in this area, but it has been slow, and it has taken a long time. In fact, in the 10 years or more of the existence of the Corporate Inclusion Index, the numbers in procurement and in governance with respect to the board have moved the fewest. And in the case of governance, in the 90s, we actually had a higher percentage of Hispanics represented on corporate boards than we do today.
So it's gone backwards somehow. You'd have thought, based on the way the world is moving, it would have gotten better, if anything.
Absolutely, yeah. No, you would think, but actually, in this particular case, it hasn't. Um, and so, what are companies doing to help improve that? Um, is some of the what we do in terms of research at our organization.
Yeah, you touched on something which was pretty interesting as well, which was the fact that you need to be able to take a risk, and sort of almost let some of the businesses in these minority communities evolve and mature to be able to scale, to be able to meet the certification requirements, all that kind of stuff. And so if you go the, I understand why the corporate could say, oh, there's no availability of minority procurement, facilitators, or no particular employees because they don't have the education. But I think that word that you use, which was, you got to be very patient, you got to be willing to take a risk, you have to do that in order for us to get to that level. And no one's comfortable with the risk. Everyone wants to have the lowest amount of risk for the
Right.
maximum amount of returns, right? I guess one way to frame that conversation is, look, it's a higher risk, but there's also higher returns because you have a new market that you can go after. I remember reading something about the Hispanic market being, the fastest growing or the largest in the U.S. And there was another statistic in The Economist. I don't know if it's still true today, but America trades more with Mexico than it does with China. And you start to think of and you're like, whoa, are you serious? That's amazing. That's astounding, really. But we don't look at it in those terms. It's always like, oh, it's too risky, and it might not necessarily match up with reality.
Right, right. No, actually, one of the data points is that the Hispanic market in this country, just the U.S., so not looking at any other countries, if it were to stand on its own, would be the fifth largest economy in the world. And so there's a lot of opportunity here. There's a lot of opportunity for companies, opportunity for businesses, and opportunities for talent to grow with this country. Because what we're looking for, we're not looking, and as with any other culture or group, we're not looking for exceptional treatment. What we're looking for is equal treatment. And so if we were given that equal chance, imagine what a difference we would make in all these areas.
I need
And
to
it's
open up a taco facility and start selling tamales or something like that. Because if that's how big the Hispanic community is, 1 trillion, or the fifth largest economy, that's crazy. That's
yeah.
huge. People don't know that information.
No, right, right. And that's the argument we take to companies is like, would you invest in the fifth largest company economy in the world? Would you invest in the one of the quickest growing economies in the world? We give them a couple other points, and usually the answer is, yeah, we would love to invest in that. And we would tell them that's the Hispanic market. That's what you're looking at. That's why it matters what you do here with our community, and and to our community. It really matters in respect to where you're going to be the next couple of years, because we're only growing. The diversity of the country is only growing, and we're going to continue to have this very large impact on the economy.
It's so interesting as well, looking at it from a US versus European perspective, because I'm based in the UK here, and London is one of the most diverse, cities in the world. And over here, there are no sort of affirmative action or, we're going to try and help out this minority community, and none, at least until the whole Black Lives Matter movement started. Then it became like, oh, we need to do more about diversity and inclusion. But maybe it's because of the geographic proximity of the UK and how much of a melting pot it is in some regards, but I don't know if that holds water, because America is also a melting pot. Or maybe it's because of the history of discrimination here is maybe not as blatant as in America, where it was a lot more prevalent. Whether that's just good marketing, I don't know. But it's such an interesting thing looking at it from a European. Here, it's almost more nationalistic than race driven, if that makes sense. So it's more like
Yeah.
previously it was like Spanish and then German and then that kind of thing, as opposed to the race issue. But yeah, I don't know if you've observed a difference between European companies or the way it works here versus the US, or are you strictly only US?
No, we do have some European companies participate on the survey, but we only evaluate their US based operations.
I see.
Um, so that's the difference. But I have heard those comments being made about the UK experience and the way it treats diversity and inclusion. Also, I've heard about France as well. It's more about nationalism. It's about, you're French if you're French, doesn't matter where
Yeah,
you're from. But
yeah. Just like the French football team.
yeah. I do think that this exists everywhere. I
Mm,
think everywhere that there is a difference between two people, particularly socioeconomically. If there is a very large percentage of one group of person and a lower end of the socioeconomic scale and others in the other end,
mm,
there exists these issues. And what the difference is in treatment, I think, is awareness. And as you said, when Black Lives Matter came and the UK businesses and other organizations became aware of it, then this became an issue that they would address because they were made aware of it. And I think that Black Lives Matter has made a huge difference globally in helping to bring these issues to light in wherever they take place. And so I think that here in this country, particularly after Black Lives Matter, we have certainly moved the needle. And with respect to procurement, which we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, after Black Lives Matter, companies started to wake up to the fact that there are these African American businesses that they could be contracting with and partnering with to supply products and do other services when they've been there the whole time. But now that they're aware of them, they're making all these efforts to do business with them, which is great. But I think that what needs to be the lesson out of this is that there are opportunities with all communities, and they need to, and they should leverage those opportunities wherever possible.
yeah, I want to stay on this topic of opportunities, because I'm sure the audience must be thinking, all right, everyone keeps talking about these opportunities, but no one's ever hitting up my LinkedIn, or no one's reaching
Yeah.
out to my business or things like that. Is it a matter like, are people not seeing these opportunities because they just don't know what portal to go to or things like that, or are they just not being reached out to on LinkedIn? How can people find these opportunities that are now coming about because it's top of mind?
Yeah, unfortunately, we still live in a very network-driven world. And so if you're on LinkedIn, you're already on the right path. That is the right place to be in order to find additional opportunities, especially in this COVID-driven world where we're all digital. Um, I think that's one place to start. Also, join groups, reach out to folks more. I personally have grown my network tremendously over the past 8 years of being in DC. Um, when we were able to meet in person, I was still asking for cards. But now that we are digital, every time I go to a conference, I hear a speaker talk, and I'm very impressed with what they're saying. First thing I do is go onto LinkedIn, look them up, send them an invitation, start a conversation, see who they're connected to. I mean, it's a bit of work, but that's what it takes in order to grow your network, grow your influence in your space. And so I think the opportunities are certainly out there. People are looking for talent always, even in these times. While some economies are doing poorly because of the unfortunate situation of the pandemic, um, let's not forget that some companies are doing very, very well as a result of that as well.
Yeah.
And so they're looking for talent. I mean, I can't tell you how much how many opportunities there are in certain companies um, as a result of this. If you've ever ordered anything from online, just look at those companies that you order from the most, and they're all looking for more talent
Yeah.
in those spaces.
Yeah.
So there are certainly opportunities, and businesses too. If you're a small business and you're providing a service or a product, look to those who are doing very well now for those opportunities.
Yeah, when I think of the tech sector, because that's where I'm in right now, and yeah, the opportunities are boundless. But the problem is that, again, some of these communities might not necessarily have the education to fulfill these kinds of jobs. A lot of them might be machine learning or AI or e-commerce and things like that, which I don't want to say requires a certain level of affluence, because there's a relatively low barrier to entry to start an e-commerce store and things like that. But even when you think of the tech giants, right, the reason, or part of the reason why the founders of a lot of these tech giants were successful is because they were either from an affluent society, or they were part of a racial group that didn't have those, that discrimination and things like that. There's a confluence of factors that led to it. If Jeff Bezos didn't have an aunt or uncle to ask for 30 grand from, you know what I mean, that some communities might not necessarily have, would there be an Amazon? If the founders
Right.
of Google didn't go to Stanford, which again is of a certain affluence or ethnic makeup and things like that. I know they're foreign, but there's a confluence of factors. And what scares me the most, to be frank with you, is the fact that not only are minority groups not prepared for this tech space, or they were, let me just say, not best suited to go into the tech space when things were really kicking off. But the problem here is that the tech space is one which is not only just growing, but it's becoming more concentrated. So it's sort of winner takes all. So, Amazon, Apple, these companies are not, small by any means. They are dominating society. I mean, being able to dominate the search bar, you're the portal to the internet. That's Google. I mean, that's a huge thing. There's no competitors there, right? It's sort of winner takes all. And so when I think of the future industries like artificial intelligence and all those kinds of things, if these minority groups are not even in that game, they're not even in the tech world, forget even the cutting edge of the tech world like AI, if they're not even in that game, then they're just not set up to be a stakeholder in that winner takes all, like when it eventually happens and that next great platform happens. So do you ever worry about this, or is this something that you think we can work on, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, then that's a huge problem. I mean, you're hitting on something that is, very meta, because it's right above us, right? Simmering on the surface of everything that we're dealing with. I mean, we deal day to day on person to person issues and sometimes company to company issues. Um, but above all that is, where's the Black Google? Where's the Latino Amazon? I mean, these things don't exist. Can they ever exist now that the field has been dominated by, which is exactly what you're saying, by these companies? That is something I don't even know. Yes, that is something that is a concern to me, and I have thought about that. But how to even approach something like that, how to even begin that? I mean, I know that there are a lot of incubators and a lot of efforts being made to grow businesses from the ground up, particularly in minority communities.
Mm.
But is that enough? When we have these companies that are so big and are able to very quickly uh, consume companies who are smaller than them and in going in the direction of their interests,
Exactly.
then maybe not. And there are several sides to this argument, right? So the first is, well, we make these companies make a fair offer to these smaller companies and buy them out, and they get to leverage the resources that they've created in order to make the product that they have better, which then benefits everyone. And then let's not forget that these companies are also working to diversify, and so one day, hopefully soon, and then in some cases, some of these companies already have minority representatives as their CEOs and top executives. So they're in a way, that's how you can answer this question, is that we have the community represented among the leaders of the company. But on the other hand, can there ever be something like these companies from minority groups, born out of minority communities, and serving with the intent of serving and representing the culture of minority communities, that will be as popular as these entities. I don't know. Only the future can tell. I mean, who would have thought that any of these companies would have succeeded in year one, right? No one. So who knows what the future will hold in terms of what's the next big thing. But it's going to be an uphill battle. But that's the beauty of entrepreneurship. I mean, that's not entrepreneurship is not going to care about how hard it is if it has the right product to present.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of this philosophical debate, which is like socialism versus capitalism. And I kind of fell in love with capitalism in its truest sense when I thought about how it's supposed to be agnostic. It's all about profit and money. And so your race doesn't really play a factor in it. So in a sense, it's a good system, because if I'm trying to make a pencil, there's a guy called Milton Friedman and said, I need to get the lead, I need to get the rubber, I need to get the wood, I need all these players. And I really don't care whether they're brown, blue, black, orange, whatever. I just want the product so I can create another product. So it's a great system. But if that system depends on your network or other things
Right.
like that, human factors, that's when the discrimination and all those other things come into play. But yeah, in its truest sense of the word and the nature, capitalism should spread prosperity and opportunity for everyone, right?
I mean, it should. If so, in my personal opinion, capitalism would be a really great system if we lived in a kind of a perfect world, if
Mm,
everything flowed smoothly, and there were none of these human issues to contend with. And in most cases, even with the human issues, they tend to work themselves out in capitalism because the best ideas win, right? So if you have something that is really not serving the community, and that community is a huge source of revenue, and your competitors do, then you lose. Um, but that doesn't always play out, particularly when we're talking about things like utilities. Um, and I say like utilities because obviously utilities are what they are and they have to serve everyone equally. But there are certain things that have propped up in our world in the past several decades, which act like utilities that everyone uses, but not everyone has access to
mm,
in equal ways.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. How much of it do you think is the responsibility of these minority groups in terms of their attitudes, in terms of their education, perception, and things like that? Because I can see it being, a very relevant or at least understandable criticism when someone can say there are no candidates or there are no minority businesses available to do X, Y, and Z because of that community's attitudes or the types of industries that they choose to go into, right? Because someone could easily say in the Hispanic community, they typically will open up restaurants and maybe soccer players or whatever stereotype that they can come up with in their mind, and say it's because of that community's attitudes and the things they choose to focus on that they're not part of this tech AI, or they're losing out on these opportunities, much like can be said for other types of communities. How do you assign, I don't know, not blame, but responsibility or attitudes of a particular cultural group within this conversation?
No, that's an interesting one because we actually have done a report on this. It's called the STEM Initiative Report, which came out, I believe, 2 years ago, 2018. And in there, we addressed this very issue.
Hmm.
And actually, what we found is that Hispanics are just as likely as white Americans to major in STEM.
Really?
But there is what we call a leaky pipeline, both in education and within the workspace. So when they enter in the STEM field in education, they'll start majoring in freshman year, and somewhere along the line, they drop out. And then also those who made it through that process will go into STEM occupations, and somewhere along the line, they'll leak out as well. Somewhere around mid-manager, the mid-manager level is where we find is where it's happening the most. But but why? So we interviewed a lot of employees in these spaces and found that they were facing a lot of stereotypes. They were facing a lot of both personal imposter syndrome, where they were like, "Well, I don't belong here. This doesn't feel like something that is for me. I don't feel welcomed," and a lot of stereotypes from others, and also the environment that the tech industry has notoriously been known for has been counter to the familial environment of the Hispanic community. And I suspect, although I haven't done any research on it, I
Mm.
suspect that other communities not being very well represented in the tech space have suffered as a result of these kinds of issues as well. Um, and so what needs to happen is there needs to be a change in the culture of tech, to be more inclusive and more welcoming to other groups. Now, that's very hard to do because, as we said in the beginning, the tech industry has made it to where it is today by being how it is. So how do you tell it, especially with a company that's starting up and fighting for its life, to be softer, to be kinder, to be more welcoming and inclusive when it has to grit down and fight every single day for its existence? This is a problem that it'll have to contend with as an industry and as a as an institution for this in this country and around the world.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. In fact, it's a bit of a segue into politics, which I know both of us are pretty interested in, outside of this. But the fact that people will choose economics over the social aspect of it, or over doing what's right and things like that, right? People will vote for this person because it aligns with my economic interest, regardless of what happens. Anyway, long story short, we've got some good news that it's the political arena is changing a little bit. So I definitely want us to touch on that. But do you see anything changing just because an administration has changed or there's a new leader at the top? Do you see any more opportunities, change of tone? Do you think it actually makes a difference who's there or not? Or is it kind of like business as usual, or economics trumps everything else?
Okay, so just for context for our listeners, it is Saturday, November 7th, 2020. So just Google it if you want to know what happened today. But this is a very big day in politics. Saka is right. And there's likely going to be a change in politics in the country. Now, the question that you're posing is a very important one. Does it matter? Does the person matter, or is it just the economy? Or as that famous 90 political saying goes, it's the economy, stupid, right? It's the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
Well, yes, the economy and economics really matters to us and to everyday people in our everyday lives, because obviously we need to have good economic sense and good economic health in our bank accounts in order to live. Um, but I think it also matters who's up top. We tell this to companies as well. It matters who your CEO is. It matters who your leadership is, and it matters politically as well who the leadership is, because and what they do, especially because that serves as an example. We find that in companies where the CEO cares about diversity and inclusion, puts it up first, and actively participates in diversity and inclusion efforts, everyone down the line does as well. The company does better. Whereas with companies where there isn't as much of that interaction, they're kind of behind the eight ball when it comes to these efforts, and they have to catch up because they're trying to do it from the bottom up. But they don't. The problem with the bottom up is the bottom doesn't have the executive powers
Mm,
to make the decisions that they need to make to change culture, whereas
mm.
the person at the top can do that immediately by setting the tone. And so, yes, I think it matters very much, and we will definitely see a difference between 2016 and 2021, how the top matters.
Everything matters. The top matters. Black lives matter. Let's make a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we don't have that much more time, but I'm sure people want to hear more about what you're doing. How can they reach out to you? How can they find out more about what you're doing? How can they access these opportunities that are now coming to the foray and forefront?
Sure, sure. So I'm still at the Hispanic Association of Corporate Responsibility, and what I do there is our annual survey. So and it opens next January, January 11th. So if you're a company that's listening and you're interested in participating, please reach out. I'm happy to have a phone call with you or your team to discuss the survey and how it can best serve you. It's totally free to take the survey. There's no charge, and everything that comes along with participation in the survey, including a personalized report for your company and a 1 hour phone call with us to dissect your results, is free as well. So please reach out to me at elopez@hacr.org for more information on that. Um, and if you're interested in reaching out to me about anything that I do outside of HACR and with my business and with other my other efforts, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at Eric_Lopez on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thank you, Saka.